No shots have been fired, but the international media has used the word warpath, the path to war. If you were a citizen of a country that had just escaped control and were asked to return to the old system, what would you do? After a series of coups from 2021 to 2023, three countries, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, announced their withdrawal from ECOWAS, the West African Economic Community, and formed the Sahel Alliance, AES, in early 2024. They called it an autonomous defense alliance, independent of France, the EU, or any other power. The response from ECOWAS was not slow. In February 2024, the organization announced that we did not recognize the existence of the AES and asked former member states to return to the democratization process under international supervision. The French media called this action a lesson for traitors, while the Algerian press described it as a sovereignty crisis, masked in the language of regional law. What do you think? Does a regional organization have the right to force member states to follow the old model? Or does each country have the right to rewrite its own future? But behind the diplomatic rhetoric, there is a tense battle of wits, where each side believes itself to be the guardian of order and the other a threat to the entire continent. Soon after the Sahel Alliance was announced, ECOWAS held a series of emergency meetings. In the press, these were billed as restoring regional order. But behind closed doors, the member states were far from unified. Nigeria, the most influential country, worried that the departure of the AES would set a precedent for other military groups to emerge. If you let countries militarize successfully, said one senior official, every democracy left in West Africa will falter. Ghana and Senegal, on the other hand, expressed concern about the use of force. They feared that a military intervention would plunge millions of people into poverty and instability. You can't bomb sovereignty and call it peace. The debate within ECOWAS was endless. Behind that is pressure from Western partners, especially France and the EU, powers that are losing influence in the Sahel region. The AES's cutting of military ties with France, expelling foreign troops, and ending bilateral agreements has angered Paris. A leaked memo shows that France has been lobbying hard for ECOWAS to take a tough stance against coup regimes, even providing logistical support if intervention is needed. But the people of Burkina Faso, Niger, and Mali find this strangely familiar, a new cycle of indirect control. Meanwhile, AES leaders have remained silent in the face of ECOWAS's threats. No loud press conferences, no provocative statements. They have simply ordered increased security coordination along the border, prepared for the first joint military exercise, and reaffirmed a single message. We do not want war, but we will not bow to anyone. On social media, a photo quickly went viral. The three presidents, Traoré, Goïta, and Tiani, shaking hands in the desert. Below was the caption, "We are not betraying anyone, we are just returning to ourselves." Questions began to emerge not only in the meeting room, but also on the streets of Lagos, Accra, and Dakar, places that were once symbols of stability. Are we on the right side? A small survey conducted by the newspaper Afrique Nouvelle showed that 43% of Nigerians questioned did not support military intervention in AES, despite the government's firm stance. A shopkeeper in Abidjan told a reporter, "We don't know much about politics, but if Traoré can make his people live more securely, have land, have electricity, what's wrong with that?" This left ECOWAS governments in a quandary. They once thought they represented a legitimate voice, but now they risk losing the trust of their own citizens. The image of a group of young leaders daring to stand up to the old model has a strange appeal. The irony is, ECOWAS was created to protect the region from conflict, but now it risks triggering one. The moral standing that the organization once held is now being questioned, not because its goals are wrong, but because its behavior is no longer appropriate to the times. At a closed-door conference in Lomé, a Ghanaian delegate stood up and protested, "We cannot use the name peace as a shield for old interests. If an organization does not change, it will become an empire." A group of intellectuals in Benin sent an open letter to ECOWAS asking, why is only AES asked to return to the democratic process, while many other member states also have human rights violations that no one talks about? Bias, inconsistency, and external pressure are pushing ECOWAS to a dangerous edge. It is no longer a story of keeping order, but a crisis of legitimacy. And while the AES government prepares for the darkest days, the people of these countries still show their support in a very special way. They are silent, but do not retreat. There is no violence, no agitation, just AES flags hung on electric poles, house doors, on the backs of buffaloes plowing, as a declaration, this is a fight for the right to choose the future. And then, in the midst of that undercurrent, Traoré decided to break the silence, not with words, but with a series of unexpected actions, forcing the whole region to watch. Would you dare to leave a powerful organization to start over on your own? There will be danger, there will be isolation, but is autonomy worth it? While ECOWAS is training to find common ground, while the media constantly emphasizes the risk of riots, in the border villages, people are still plowing their fields, building schools, rebuilding after the war, because for them, politics only makes sense when it touches their land, their food, and the safety of their families. And then, in the midst of that undercurrent, Traoré decided to break the silence, not with words, but with a series of unexpected actions, forcing the whole region to watch, while the international media and the ECOWAS countries continued to debate the AES threat. In Ouagadougou, Bamako, and Niamey, things began to move at an unexpected pace. No long speeches, no defiant press conferences, just action. On June 15th, the governments of the three AES countries simultaneously issued a decree to reorganize their armies. Each country sent an elite battalion to the Sahel Triangle to participate in a joint exercise called Sahel Shield. This was not just a simple exercise. It was a clear message. We are ready to defend ourselves. Ibrahim Traoré himself was on the scene in uniform, without bodyguards, shaking hands with each soldier. In a moment that went viral on social media, he said, "People ask why we are not afraid. I answer, because for the first time in history, we stand on this land without anyone directing us." At the same time, local governments were ordered to set up early warning systems in border areas with Nigeria and Benin, two countries that remain loyal members of ECOWAS. Although they did not say it, people understood. They were preparing for all possibilities, including conflict. It is worth noting that these measures were not carried out in a military show of force. All were embedded in a national media campaign called Security Self-Reliance. If it were you, faced with the risk of intervention, would you wait or proactively build your own defense line? How do you think the government should explain its actions so as not to create fear among the people? But the most striking difference in the AES response was not the military. It was the way they mobilized the population, not through violence, but through community spirit. In Burkina Faso, local radio stations began broadcasting a program called Citizenship in Transition. Farmers, teachers, and students were invited to speak, sharing their thoughts on sovereignty, preparing for an economic siege, and most of all, trust in the new government. A primary school teacher in the Kaya region said on the radio, "For the first time, I saw a government that didn't talk much but did something. Even though it was difficult, I chose to stay in class because the future of the children was more important than fear." Soon after, Sovereignty Week was launched in all three AES countries. Students painted pictures of the country, young people took part in garbage cleanups, and volunteer groups organized outdoor screenings of historical films. In the viral photos, people held up three fingers, representing Burkina Faso, Mali and Niger, not to protest, but to declare one thing. We do not want war, but we will not back down. In Niger, people also held outdoor prayers to ask for peace for the country. Although there was no official call from the government, churches and mosques prayed together every Friday afternoon. The image of a poor country still holding its head high, still believing in a protector greater than politics, brought many people to tears. What is more special? The AES government did not ban dissenting voices. Some independent newspapers still published opinions criticizing the policy of militarizing society too quickly. However, there were no arrests, no repression, and that was what surprised many people the most. Outside the region, Western analysts are starting to worry if three poor countries once considered incompetent to govern become models of self-reliance. It raises big questions about the whole system that France and the EU are backing. Can a government build strength by giving back trust to its people instead of controlling them? Do you think the AES model of autonomy can spread without external financial backing? But just when AES seemed to be stabilizing the domestic front, an unexpected event from the outside struck, putting everything they had built at risk of being reversed in an instant. Not wanting to allow the AES to consolidate its power, eco-ways began to strike. Not with tanks, but with diplomatic and economic measures that were more quietly devastating than any cannon. On the 2nd of July, ECOWAS announced a partial trade embargo on the three AES countries. Regional banks were ordered to stop all transfers to Burkina Faso, Mali and Niger. Borders with Nigeria and Benin were tightened. Consignments of agricultural products, fuel and medicine began to be held up at checkpoints. ECOWAS nominally described these as preventive measures aimed at forcing the coup regimes to return to the democratic process. But in reality, the first to be affected were not the governments, but the poor people who depended on the cross-border flow of goods. In rural Niger, a resident named Ada told a local reporter, "I used to walk to Nigeria to buy salt and soap. Now I have to pay 3 times more, and I'm not sure if I'll get any. My children are starting to get sick because of the lack of medicine." But that was just the beginning. ECOWAS, along with France and the EU, also pushed international financial institutions such as the IMF and the World Bank to stop funding AES. They cited the unstable political environment as making financial support risky. A series of water supply, agricultural development, and poverty reduction projects were put on hold indefinitely. This created a double whammy. The AES government had to manage with its own limited resources, while the population was pressured by soaring prices. Analysts describe this as a slow suicide strategy. Instead of launching a military attack, they tightened the economy to turn people against the government. Do you think a regional organization can use its own people as a tool of coercion in the name of democracy? Would you support sanctions if the poor were the first to pay the price? But the counterattack did not stop there. When the financial strangulation strategy was not effective enough, a more daring plan began to emerge from the shadows with a clear goal: to isolate and disintegrate AES from within. When economic sanctions failed to subdue the AES, strategists from ECOWAS and its backers began to deploy a second option: an attack from within. The regional media suddenly became abuzz with anonymous articles accusing AES members of internal conflicts. Some international channels even reported that Mali is unhappy with Traoré's control of AES media, or Niger is being excluded from important policy decisions. Although these reports were unverified and quickly denied by the governments, the campaign's goal was achieved: to sow doubt within the AES people themselves, where unity is the strongest moral weapon. ECOWAS did not stop at the media, but also encouraged opposition groups in each AES country, the old political forces that had been disbanded, to return to underground activities. Independent media reports have revealed that campaign funds are flowing underground from Lagos, the current Paris, to pro-democracy groups in Burkina Faso. Chaos is brewing. Small protests have erupted in the capital, calling for returning power to the people. Although not large-scale, they were enough for international media to film and headline. AES begins to crack. Meanwhile, AES governments have been forced to react quickly. They have tightened controls on foreign money flows, tightened regulations on non-governmental organizations, NGOs, and launched a transparency and trust campaign, inviting citizens to public seminars on autonomy, the economy, and security. Yet many observers are concerned that ECOWAS's provocations are accelerating the process of confrontation, not only between the two blocs, but also within countries, where fragile stability is only maintained by trust and determination. Who do you think is the real winner in a confrontation where both sides have lost the trust of their own people? If democracy is the ultimate goal, why use the media as a tool to divide? But just when it seemed that everything was approaching the point of collapse, an unexpected event occurred, not from ECOWAS, not from the West, but from a long silent force, the remaining Africans. As all eyes were on the confrontation between ECOWAS and AES, an unexpected event took place in Libreville, Gabon. Within the framework of the expanded Conference of SAMAC, the bloc of Central African countries, the president of Gabon, together with representatives from Chad, the Republic of Congo, the Central African Republic, and Equatorial Guinea, made a brief but shocking statement. We support the autonomy of every African country in choosing its own development model. Without mentioning AES by name, everyone understood this was a quiet handshake, a support in principle, coming from countries that were also deeply influenced by the French colonial system. Just days later, AES delegations were invited to a closed-door meeting in Bangui, Central African Republic, where President Faustin Archange Touadéra, who had held his country together against both insurgents and international intervention, proposed the creation of a new forum, African Self-Reliance, a community of non-ECOWAS and non-CAN states willing to support each other in security, trade, and energy. This was a surprising counterattack. AES was no longer alone, and ECOWAS was no longer the only regional force with a political voice. At the same time, Russia, Turkey, and even Brazil began to quietly reopen diplomatic channels with AES, expressing interest in long-term cooperation, especially in the fields of solar energy and minerals. Without making any public announcements, the world realized AES might be establishing a new axis of influence. How do you think the world would change if African countries stood together, not following orders from the North? If you were the leader of a small but autonomous country, would you choose to remain silent or speak up like Gabon did? But there was one thing AES had yet to do, something that caught ECOWAS off guard, until the message was broadcast simultaneously on 3 national channels. Then the camera panned to ordinary people, a Nigerian mother teaching her child to read the alphabet in chalk on the ground, a Malian teacher lecturing under a bombed-out school, a young soldier in Burkina Faso bowing his head in prayer before going on patrol. No declaration of war, no words of condemnation of ECOWAS, just images, just facts. Less than 24 hours later, the video went viral across Africa with the hashtag #Bibubun We Not Bowing. Artists, academics, and celebrities in Congo, Angola, and even Senegal voiced their support. A Benin journalist wrote, "We are witnessing a counterattack of faith, without weapons, just truth and dignity." ECOWAS's response was muted. No new statements, no emergency meetings, no further sanctions. Because when a war becomes symbolic, all weapons become meaningless. What do you think makes a government stronger? The defense budget or the truth? If you were the one to deliver a message that changed history, what would you say to your children and grandchildren? But despite the media victory for AES, the biggest question remains how to maintain real peace when the world is becoming more and more divided. In every battle, the strong do not always win. But the ones who stand firm in the truth always leave their mark. And sometimes what changes a continent is not guns, but beliefs. When three young leaders decided to step out of the old system, they did not simply choose a new political path. They chose to ask the fundamental question that millions had avoided: who really has the right to decide the fate of Africa? In their evening prayers, in poor villages far from the lights of electricity, people do not pray for more tanks. They pray for children to be educated, for adults to have food to eat, for this land to live up to the dignity that God gave it from the beginning of creation. And perhaps it is that, not policies, not speeches, that changes everything. How do you think your children will learn about this confrontation in their textbooks? If it were you, what would be the ending to Africa's new chapter? Do you believe that justice, truth, and faith in God can coexist in politics? Leave your answer below. Who knows? You might be writing a part of the future.